This happened a few winters ago. I had just finalized my divorce about 6 months earlier, and to put it lightly, I needed a reset. Emma, my girlfriend at the time, suggested we take a trip somewhere quiet, something different from the chaos I'd been dealing with. We found a rental on a lake in upstate New York, and I booked it for a week without much thought. The place was exactly what I was looking for. A modern but cozy house positioned right on the lake, surrounded by woods, with only a handful of other properties scattered along the shoreline. Most of them were empty. It wasn't exactly peak season for lakefront living. I welcomed that, though. I really just wanted to be as far from civilization as possible. The host wasn't going to be there, but he gave us detailed instructions on where to find the keys and some information about the house. You know, all the standard Airbnb stuff. We arrived in the morning, and when we got there, a small package was sitting on the front steps waiting for us. There was no return address, just a little handwritten note that said, "Enjoy your stay. Make sure to stay warm." That part was kind of sweet, but there was something else in the package. A tiny box of matches. We figured it was some kind of welcome gift, a weird one but harmless enough. Emma laughed and made a joke about how upstate folks have always been a bit odd. And that was that. The next 2 days were exactly what we wanted. Long hikes through the snow, hot drinks by the fireplace, total peace and quiet. Oh, I should probably mention that the snow had been steadily falling since we arrived. It wasn't quite a blizzard because there wasn't much wind or fog, but there was enough snow to make the landscape feel untouched. It was perfect. I think it's a good time to describe the layout of the house, at least somewhat. The master bedroom where we slept was on the second floor. It had these massive windows across from the bed that overlooked the lake. The roof, or at least the windows, must have been pretty thin, because we could hear the patter of snowflakes from inside, which was a really nice touch. There was also a skylight in there, so we could fall asleep to the beautiful sky and snow. Sometime after midnight on the third night, I woke up to a sound. It was barely audible over the wind and snow. The first thing I noticed was actually the storm. The snowfall had gotten considerably heavier since I'd fallen asleep, and the outdoors was starting to resemble more of a blizzard. I shifted my focus back to the sound and realized why it stood out. It sounded man-made, almost mechanical, unlike the natural sounds you'd expect to hear out in the wilderness. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake Emma, and made my way across the room. I looked out the window and saw the last thing I expected, a snowmobile. It was moving slowly across the ice. I know it's not the most unusual thing. People drive snowmobiles on frozen lakes all the time. But I was so confused, given how late it was. The snow was falling more heavily now, so visibility wasn't great, but I could still make out the shape. The driver was moving cautiously, like they weren't completely sure about the ice. Then they just stopped entirely. I watched as the person climbed off and started waving their hands, like they were in distress. It looked like they were shouting, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. To my horror, I realized they were facing the direction of our house. Did they know we were there? It was impossible. Either way, it looked like they needed help, so I woke Emma and told her what was happening. Then I got dressed, went downstairs, and stepped outside onto the deck. It was freezing, even with the layers I was wearing. As soon as I opened the door, I got hit with another surprise. The person on the ice was a woman. I could tell because she was shouting for help, saying, "Thank God someone's there," and repeating that she'd lost her little boy somewhere in the snowstorm. It sounded like she was crying or borderline hysterical. It wasn't a question of whether I'd help. If there was a child out there in that weather, all alone, they wouldn't last long. I laced my boots and made my way toward the lake, telling Emma to stay inside. As I approached the woman, I started to make out more details of her appearance. She was bundled up in a thick fur coat, and her hair was pulled back into a tight braid. The ice was completely solid. There wasn't even a chance of falling through. So I started to relax, knowing it would have been impossible for that little boy to have fallen through. As I got closer, she started saying he had run away from home and that she was looking for him. That statement gave me pause. I had expected her to say something like he'd fallen off her snowmobile and she hadn't noticed. Then I started to think about how ridiculous even that story was. How do you not notice your own kid falling off a snowmobile? The adrenaline must have been clouding my judgment because I hadn't even thought about that until right then. I was just about to ask her for more details when she said something that made me freeze. She asked if I still had those matches, and I could tell she was smiling. For a split second, I had no idea what she was talking about. Then it all clicked at once. The matches, that package from the first day, the note. She had left it, not our host. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. She demanded my wallet and phone, and I gave them to her. I had no choice. The whole interaction happened in less than 30 seconds. Without another word, she climbed back onto the snowmobile and disappeared into the whiteout. As she sped away, I turned toward the house and ran as fast as I could on the ice, shouting for Emma to call the police. She was already on the phone with them when I made it back to the house. I locked the doors and paced the room, still shaking. I kept looking outside, half expecting to see that snowmobile circling back. The cops showed up about an hour later. By that point, the fresh snowfall had already covered any tracks that woman had left behind. Emma was hysterical, but I was mostly angry. I had come here for peace. There was hope, though. I couldn't think of a reliable way that woman had gotten her snowmobile onto the lake, so I expected the police to at least find the vehicle abandoned somewhere. Unfortunately, I was wrong. The police searched the area and found an old boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess was that she had come from there. I was furious and insisted they keep looking. But they told me what I already knew. There wasn't much they could do. Even if she left something behind, they'd never find it in all the snow. With Emma's help, I tried tracking my phone, but by that point, it was already offline. The one good thing about the whole ordeal was that the Airbnb host refunded the entire trip. He sounded genuine on the phone and confirmed he knew nothing about a welcome package. But something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. How could that woman have possibly known we'd be staying there? And why go to such elaborate lengths just for a simple robbery? I couldn't help but think the host had something to do with it, but I had no proof. I brought it up with Airbnb, but they were about as helpful as you'd expect. I've always been a paranoid guy, but for the longest time after that, I couldn't help feeling my ex-wife had something to do with it. It makes me angry writing about this. I can just imagine her laughing at my expense. I've since come to terms with how unlikely that possibility is, but the whole thing still doesn't make sense. Even now, I have no idea why someone would do all that just for a wallet and phone, unless they were seriously messed up and got some kind of sick pleasure out of it. My family owns a Northern California lake house that we visit for a couple of short weeks out of the year during prime summer weather. It's 2 stories tall with an attic. When my younger sister Lily and I were little, we used to climb into the attic and pretend we were camping with sleeping bags. We'd even bring our puppy up there. There was one small window in the attic that we'd peer through to look down at the lake. We always got a kick from watching people. In our early teenage years, we got too big for both of us to stay in the attic comfortably, so that put an end to our sleeping bag antics. Looking back, it was a little sad, but everyone's got to grow up eventually. When our grandparents died, my parents inherited the rest of their furniture. We had some space to fit the bigger pieces, but the attic ended up stuffed with the smaller hand-me-down items. My parents didn't have the heart to get rid of any of it, as it was all they had left of my Nana and Pop. It felt bittersweet putting all their stuff up there, but it was reassuring knowing little pieces of their most cherished items were still watching over us in a way. That whole period felt like the end of my childhood, and I bet Lily would agree. As we got older, it got harder for my family to make it out to the lake house due to my studies and my parents' work. At best, we could maybe get 1 week off for a family trip, but nothing beyond that. My parents didn't want to rent it out during the many months we weren't there because they were scared of getting their antiques stolen or broken by sketchy tenants. So for most of the year, it was more or less abandoned, only really kept up by the landscapers my parents hired. A few years back, they met a local elderly veteran, now working as an antique craft restorationist, and eventually signed a year-long lease with him, trusting him not to rough up the place. He was a small, disfigured man with white hair and one of those gruff, greasy beards. We all thought he looked a bit bizarre, with a gravelly off-putting voice to match. But my dad bonded with the guy over his military background. My dad told us, reassuringly, that none of us understood what it was like to lay your life down for your country, and that guys like him deserved a good deal on a place to stay. We didn't really have a say in what my dad decided, but I can tell you firsthand that this elderly man seriously creeped me out. Besides that, we were all a bit sour about my dad signing the lease, because it meant we wouldn't be able to visit the lake house in the summer. Anyway, my parents could use the extra cash while putting us through college, so Lily and I got over it. Even though our parents trusted him to keep the place from burning down, they'd periodically check in on him through a little prodding from the landscaper workers. Plus, my parents had to make sure he hadn't fallen or had any issues that had gone unnoticed. These indirect check-ins seemed like the perfect solution. We stayed out of his business but still got peace of mind. You might call that a little invasive, but this guy was getting a great deal on the place anyway. I guess an elderly, crusty guy in his twilight years couldn't care less about occasional questions from laid-back landscapers now and then. It wasn't like he could physically keep the lake house in shape by himself. My dad reasoned that his rent at least covered the maintenance. Despite him seeming like a decent tenant, that all went out the window when the maintenance guys pointed out his predatory behavior to my mom over the phone. They told her that while doing landscaping for the neighbors' yards, they'd often spot him sitting oddly on the porch, staring at the children by the lake. They said they'd caught him doing other things too, which I don't feel comfortable repeating. My mom was a real saint and absolutely loathed the idea of a disfigured old man eyeing children while being a tenant in her beloved lake house. For months, she talked my dad's ear off about it until he couldn't take it anymore. I still remember my mom screaming at him about how irresponsible it was for us to accommodate a potential predator. My dad finally cracked when the year-long lease was up. He tried to let the guy down easy. He had high respect for him as a veteran. My dad lied and told him they planned on having some work done to the house that would leave him without electricity or plumbing for a few months. The guy left without too much fuss. It wasn't like the money my parents made off him was great. They assumed he'd find another spot just fine. My mom told my dad to stop worrying about him so much. She wanted him out of there as quickly as possible, so we even paid the landscaping guys a little extra to help him grab his belongings. Admittedly, I was also kind of happy to see him gone. It had always felt weird that someone so strange had basically unlimited access to our house. About a year after that, Lily graduated college. So my parents seized the opportunity, clocked in their sick days, and flew us out for a summer trip to the lake house. My parents had recently gotten a black lab mix named Shadow, who Lily hadn't met yet, so she was especially thrilled. I'll skip the irrelevant stuff, but by the time we made it to the house, the sun had just started setting. So we decided to leave Shadow inside while we grabbed dinner in town. The house wasn't stocked with groceries, so we didn't really have another option. Before we left, I noticed Shadow was acting strange. His ears were perked up, and he kept pacing like he was waiting for something. I figured he was just restless from the long trip and brushed it off. We weren't gone long, just enough time to eat and let the heat die down. But when we stepped back inside, something felt off, seriously off. Before I could say anything, I saw Shadow. He was sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, panting hard. Lily screamed, and I realized there was blood smearing the floor beneath him. My mom immediately pulled out her phone, presumably to call 911. Without a word, my dad made his way into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I followed suit, and the two of us slowly searched the house for the intruder. By the time we made it to the top floor, my dad motioned for me to stop. It took me a second, but I realized what he was looking at. The attic hatch was open. It wasn't wide open, just cracked, but enough that we could see the faint glare of a flashlight shining down. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was petrified with fear in that moment. If it weren't for my dad, I don't know what would have happened. Without hesitation, he yanked the hatch and bounded up the ladder. I didn't follow this time, I was too scared. I listened, expecting to hear some kind of fight, but no such sound came instead. A few moments later, my dad climbed back down, seemingly calm. He whispered to me that it was our old tenant, and I could tell he was really torn about what to do. My mom eventually came running up the stairs, and when she found out what was going on, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. My dad wanted to let the guy go, but my mom wasn't having it. She had already called the police, so that was that. When the police arrived, they went up to the attic and carried the guy down the ladder. He looked like he was in really bad shape, and I could tell my dad had nothing but sympathy. The police found our house key on him, which also angered my mom because my dad had told her he'd changed the locks. Luckily, Shadow survived, although he was seriously injured. As awful as what that man had done, my dad refused to press charges, no matter what my mom or Lily said to convince him. That was actually one of the biggest fights my parents ever had, and I never understood why my dad had so much sympathy for someone who had stabbed his dog. This all took place about a year ago, and we haven't been back to the lake house since. I really hate to say it, but this experience seriously tainted my childhood image of that house. I can't say I want to go back anytime soon. This happened last summer. I was 20 years old. My name is Ethan. My friend Noah comes from a very wealthy family. His dad is an intellectual property lawyer who contracts with the United States government or something. They've got a bunch of properties all over the country and a handful of international ones too. That's the kind of wealth I'm talking about. One of their houses is on a relatively large, but overall pretty secluded lake. The lake itself isn't so big that you can't see the houses on the other side, but it would be a serious workout swimming across the whole thing. Noah's parents were never around, so he pretty much had unlimited access to that house and often invited friends over, with permission, of course. There's something about being out on the lake that makes you feel invincible. It's a different feeling than the beach, for sure. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but there's more of an exclusive vibe to it. Hopefully, I can be successful enough to afford one someday. Like I said, the lake itself is pretty secluded. Big fancy houses line the perimeter, but most of them usually sit dark and empty. A lot of them were vacation homes for people who barely use them. It's honestly kind of a shame thinking about it. There are upsides to that, though. Noah would throw the craziest parties there, because there were usually no neighbors to call the police. This night was different, though. It was just the two of us having a more chill night. I won't get into it, but I had just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years, and I was in dire need of some bro time. We were having a few beers out on the dock when I noticed a light flickering across the lake. I can't remember exactly what time it was. At first, I thought it was just the sun perfectly reflecting off something into my eye, but even when I moved my head to the side, I could still see it. It was flashing, like someone was turning a light on and off repeatedly. I told Noah, and the two of us became fixed on it, trying to figure out what it could be. At some point, we realized the flashing wasn't random. It was following a pattern: 3 short bursts, followed by 3 longer ones, followed by 3 short ones. I guess I'm dumb for not knowing this, but Noah snapped his fingers and said it was Morse code. I looked at him like he was crazy and asked when in the world he'd learned Morse code. He told me he didn't actually know it, but he knew what 3 short, 3 long, 3 short meant. Sauce. I called bees and pulled out my phone, but to my surprise he was right. Maybe I'm dumb for not knowing that, but I'm not really one for obscure knowledge. Anyway, the flashing continued for another minute or so, following that same pattern, before stopping abruptly. The two of us had just been staring at it the whole time. I really didn't know what to think. It could have been a joke, but there was always the chance that someone was actually in trouble. Noah immediately suggested calling the cops, but I reminded him that we'd been drinking, and we weren't legal yet. I was honestly fighting a Dewey charge at the time, so the last thing I needed was another run-in with the police. He wasn't thrilled about that answer, and I could tell he was torn about the situation. The two of us couldn't really think of a rational explanation besides a kidnapping or something along those lines. We thought it might have been someone who had fallen and needed help, but that didn't make sense, because they probably would have just called the police. We've always been those adventurous, delinquent type guys, so we decided it was worth checking out ourselves. If it turned out to be serious, we'd call the police then. We went back inside. Noah's brother had a bunch of switchblades lying around his room. He was kind of a weird kid, so we grabbed a few of them, just for peace of mind. Noah said he was good to drive, and that we should drive around the lake to that house, but I told him I really wasn't comfortable with that for obvious reasons. He joked about my situation, and I laughed it off. If we weren't driving, there was only really one other option. The two of us walked back out to the yard and dragged Noah's dad's kayak into the water. We were laughing at first, enjoying the adventure of it all, but the farther out we got onto the lake, the quieter we got. I think both of us realized how dumb of an idea it was, but neither of us wanted to be the one to spoil the fun. The sun had almost fully set at that point, and it was getting harder to see. It wasn't pitch black or anything. We had light from some of the lake houses to guide us, but it was still a bit unsettling. As we got closer, the house came into view. It was big, like the others, but it was obviously not maintained well. For starters, the dock was half collapsed. Literally half of it was just sunken into the water. The flashing had also stopped, which was kind of a bad sign too. We had planned on tying the kayak to the dock, but we obviously couldn't do that anymore, given how unstable it looked. Luckily, the yard wasn't too high above the water, so we beached the kayak on the yard instead, careful not to slip on the rocks. I felt the adrenaline rush start coming on. I could tell Noah was feeling the same thing. We looked up toward the house. The light had been coming from the second floor. That much we knew. Noah was freaking out at that point and insisted we just leave and call the police. I told him we'd have to kayak all the way back to his house to even do that, as there was no service on the lake and we'd need to connect to Wi-Fi. I reminded him that we'd explored 1,000,000 abandoned buildings before, and this wasn't too different. He wasn't thrilled with that logic but agreed anyway. Believe me, I know how dumb this was. Everyone I've talked to about this shares that same opinion, but I've never been one to make good decisions, and neither is Noah. We didn't walk to the front door. That would have been suicide. Instead, we crept around the house until we found an unlocked window. The two of us silently slipped inside. The house was empty. Not just abandoned, but empty, like stripped. There was no furniture, no junk, nothing. To be frank, there were no signs that anyone had ever even lived there. The floors and walls were completely bare. We moved cautiously through the rooms, looking for the stairs. There was no one in sight, and all the rooms were just as empty as the first one had been. We finally found the stairs and slowly made our way up. I had made a mental note of where the window was, and we walked down one of the hallways until we got to what I guessed was the room the light had been coming from. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing. I glanced over at Noah. He nodded, and I carefully pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for one thing by the window. I tiptoed over to it and realized what it was, an old projector, and it was facing the window. Alarm bells immediately went off in my head. This was a trap. Someone had set this up deliberately. Noah must have realized the same thing, because I just heard him start sprinting back the way we'd come, not even trying to be quiet. I turned without another thought and followed him. As we were running down the stairs, I heard a door, presumably a closet door, swing open from the room I'd just been in, followed by rapid thumping sounds. We bolted down the stairs and back through the house to that first window. Noah jumped through, and I was next. As I was climbing through, I heard those footsteps behind me again, bounding down the stairs. I didn't even look. I just made it through the window and ran to catch up with Noah, who was already down by the lake's edge. As I was running to catch up to him, I heard him curse, and I quickly realized why. The kayak was gone. I turned, and from the side of the house, there was a person running toward us. I could barely process what I was seeing. He was fast. I couldn't get a good look at him, but he was big, definitely an adult. I pulled out my switchblade, ready to defend myself. I expected Noah to do the same, but instead he turned and jumped straight into the lake. Sneakers, hoodie, everything. I didn't even think, I just followed. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I swam as fast as I could, trying to fight the burning sensation in my arms and legs. We swam toward the light from Noah's house, which looked like it was miles away. The swim felt endless, but on pure adrenaline we made it. By the time we dragged ourselves onto Noah's dock, I thought I had hypothermia. I don't think I've ever been that cold in my life. We ran straight inside, locked every door, and called the police. It took them almost an hour to show up. It was honestly kind of outrageous. When they finally did, they went straight across the lake to investigate. They were over there for a while, but when they came back, they told us exactly what I expected to hear. There was no one. They confirmed the house had been abandoned for years. No signs of recent occupancy, no footprints, no gear, no personal belongings, nothing. Just an empty house. They weren't happy with us. They gave us the whole, "Why didn't you call first?" speech. Noah's parents were even more pissed when they found out. Let's just say I wasn't invited back to the lake house after that. Noah told me his parents were threatening to sue the town for allowing something like that to happen and the police for refusing to investigate further. As for me, I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who was in that house, why they set that trap, or what they planned to do if we hadn't run. I don't think I want to. Most of my friends agree it was a trap and think whoever was planning it got cold feet until the last minute. I really don't want to think about what would have happened if they had gone through with whatever they were planning.